Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today, both in person and online. My name is Ryan and I'm a proud Gandangara and Bundjalung man, and I'm also the head of the Ormond College Indigenous Subcommittee. I'll be giving today's Acknowledgement of Country. I would like to begin the acknowledgement by paying respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land we are on today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Kulin Nation, and also further extend this respect to the lands of which those online are joining from. I also extend these respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I further acknowledge the ongoing connection Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to nurture with the land, sea and their communities, and that sovereignty has never been ceded and the land we are on always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you.
Welcome to the 12th Renate Kamener Oration, and thank you for supporting the Renate Kamener Scholarship, a partnership we've established with Ormond College to support the tertiary education of Indigenous students. Renate Kamener, our mother, whose name the scholarship remembers, grew up in the shadows of World War I and World War II. Throughout her life, in her own small way, she sought to counter national and cultural oppression with her deep-seated belief that good educational outcomes were essential to freedom and a better world, and that discussion was better than argument, and that listening was as important as speaking. This is the key driver to this scholarship and to the choice of speakers that we've been lucky enough to have been able to bring here over the years. In a few weeks' time, Passover will be celebrated by Jewish people all over the world. And the significant tradition of Passover is to read from the Haggadah, a story which tells of how Moses led the Jewish slaves out of Egypt. The annual reciting of this legend over the millennia serves to remind us of a time when the Jewish culture and language survived against all odds, and it reinforces the importance of being free to tell the story of one's culture to one's own people in one's own words. The version we read around our Passover table each year reminds us that the same struggle continues today in so many places throughout the world. The struggle for cultures to survive, to speak, to sing, and to aspire in their own way. When a journalist recently asked a commentator on the Ukraine-Russia war, "Do you really think the Ukrainians can win?" it started a meditation on my behalf. What do we mean by winning? Like, is there a final siren to this war? And when you see the physical destruction of the Ukraine, the question is hard to answer in the affirmative. But when one hears the determination of the Ukrainian people to persist in the face of such destruction, the concept of what they are fighting for is perhaps more spiritual. And the definition of winning changes as we allow the importance of cultural continuity on traditional land to be a part of the answer. As we worry so deeply about our world today, we must remember that in the late 18th century, a vibrant society and culture in Australia was decimated and its extinction predicted. Yet today we witness a different story. And amidst flourishing music, art, story and language, our two speakers today will remind us that not only hasn't this happened, but most importantly, that it won't happen. Our orator, Noel Pearson, has been a part of this struggle for a long time, and our scholarship recipient who's speaking today, Todd Fernando, his struggle has just begun. But that they both stand here as Indigenous Australians with aspirations and dreams shows the struggles of their ancestors to keep their culture alive has not been in vain. Today, Todd and Noel will reinforce for us the strength and determination of Indigenous Australians to tell their own story to their next generations in their own way. Larry and I and our families thank you for your support for the Renate Kamener Scholarship, which in a small way aims to help in this quest. Now I welcome Todd to the stand.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their ancestors past, present and emerging? Can I also acknowledge Professor Marcia Langton, Noel Pearson, Marty and Larry, Ormond scholars, distinguished guests, friends. For those of you who are not yet met, my name is Todd Fernando. I'm a descendant of the Kalari peoples of the Wurundjeri Nation, identify as queer and use pronouns he, him. I'm the Victorian Commissioner for LGBTIQ+ communities, the second person to hold this groundbreaking position after Ro Allen, who's become Victoria's Human Rights Commissioner. In this position over the past 10 months, Victoria has achieved so much for LGBTIQ+ people. My team finalised and launched the Victorian Government's whole of government 10-year LGBTIQ+ strategy to be embedded across all levels of government in this state. My remit and my role in this strategy is very simple: to make Victoria the most safe and protected place for LGBTIQ+ people anywhere in Australia and the world. Simple enough. But my experience in this role has shown me just how much possible it is to achieve that goal. So when Marty and Larry asked me to reflect on my time as a Kamener scholar at Ormond College and my impending graduation from my PhD, looking to you, Marcia, I thought about the many people in this institution that this institution, both Ormond and the University of Melbourne, has produced. In reflecting about that, I thought about the calibre of the future of First Nations students and the graduates from the University of Melbourne. So with them in mind, I posed the question: is our goal to produce a more robust cohort of First Nations people and competent non-Indigenous allies who will take on Australia's future? For well over a decade now, institutions like the University of Melbourne has played a vital role in affirming the ambitions of First Nations staff and students. This is achieved in part with an advanced strategy with colleges like the Ormond and Trinity and others. But it is the students who enter these places with the hope of transforming their own lives and begin to shift the mindset of their families and communities that is so important. So the nation building project in this way for First Nations communities is a reality and a role that we all play. Generations of young First Nations people we know were raised in survival modes. However, increasingly, students entering universities do so with successful parents, yet sadly we know that this is not enough. While hope has been instilled in this generation, it is the drive that many of these students harbour that will see the economic prosperity of Aboriginal communities. This generation, though, is further away from its ancient roots, with many drifting away from its traditions and its practices. What stands in its place is the emergence of a new Indigenous cultural norm that straddles the prospect of a new Australia. An Australia made up of its ancient roots, its continued tie to colonial rule and multiculturalism, which is slowly embedding its tentacles into the Australian landscape. With a republic future, this Australia will forcibly find its way into university and colleges. For the University of Melbourne and its colleges, we find ourselves in stiff competition to continue to cultivate a new class of people ready for this futurised Australia. The University of Melbourne produced the first graduate of Cambridge University in Dr. Lily Brown. Ormond College not only produced a commissioner, but the second Aboriginal Rhodes Scholar in B. Jones, the first being South Australia's Rebecca Richards. Many First Nation graduates of Uni Melbourne and its colleges have gone on to do and lead some amazing projects and organisations. Ormond College has assisted in the growth of many skilled and, importantly, highly employable First Nations people. With a track record of students graduating from various fields at both an undergraduate and graduate level, we find ourselves, however, at the crossroads of student innovation and competition from other universities and colleges. So it begs me to ask the question: who bears responsibility for the success of these students beyond just attending our universities and our colleges? While we know that all successful completions of university qualifications by First Nations people continue to justify the national strategy of advancing these Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students to lead their communities to lead safer lives, my concern is that the centuries-long competition that has bred some of the globe's best has fallen short on being impactful on the minds of these young First Nations people. The University of Melbourne and its colleges stake claim in many world-class leaders, and they have continued ties to the companies and the institutions that they lead. How might we leverage and proffer these connections as a tool to help continue to advance a people on the verge of true economic prosperity? COVID has seen a rapid decline in student enrolment, and those in crucial university and college positions are working hard to remedy those effects. However, I believe the missing ingredient in mitigating the future risk of a continued decline is perhaps a failure to recognise that the culture of universities and its colleges are somewhat made unattractive because of COVID. COVID, I think, has also provided an opportunity for all of us across many industries to stop and, in some cases, reset. While firm in its intention, the University of Melbourne's Indigenous strategy may quickly become fragile if the urgent response to competition and attractiveness is not responded to or realised. But of course, this also means that the university colleges, looking at you, Ormond and Trinity and Medley and others, will need to bear the weight of this responsibility too. How many First Nations people whom have we grown so successfully sit on the boards or councils of these colleges? Or how many are in key leadership positions? That number is very, very little. So I must ask why. Why not are we growing a leadership strategy where our institutions are benefiting on a return on strategic investments from the many graduates that we have cultivated? Many of us are thinking about this, and I know that people like Marcia and Barry Judd will chart a course to answer these questions and lead the institution to build back better. I trust that these reflections are taken within the frame of wanting our institutions to become highly sought after and valued by Indigenous people. Our First Nations students also becoming highly valued in a talent pool that is no longer unique. Having a bachelor's degree and being Indigenous is no longer unique. But we've done it before, and we can do it again, so the reflections from this pandemic and out of this pandemic must be viewed in this way. They must become aligned also in the strategy of the university and its colleges, because failure to do so will mean that we produce ordinary people, which I believe is just not good enough. So, moreover, from what I know, it is also not the legacy of the Kamener family and their philanthropy to cultivate ordinary people. So, with that in mind, I'm excited about the next phase of this growth, and I'm sure that Noel, in his oration, will offer more weight and context of the next phase of Australia. So, in that in mind, thank you, and thank you for your continued support.
It goes without saying that, I think Marty and I had dinner with Todd and some of the other scholarship recipients the other night. Enormous pride to see what they're going on to achieve, and Todd, as the first, I think if I got this right, Todd, the first Indigenous person to hold a commissioner role in Victoria. So that's outside the Indigenous spheres of government, is just absolutely fantastic. So welcome. Welcome everyone, welcome in particular to the past oration givers who are here, Gareth Evans and Marcia Langton. I think that's, Mark Dreyfus has just arrived there. So we've got three past oration givers, so great to have all three of you here, two past Attorney Generals, which is fantastic. Possibly a future Attorney General, but we won't go there, Mark. I just want to briefly introduce Noel. Noel is, let me see if I've got this right, Noel, from the Gugu Yimandjara community of Hopevale in Cape York. Noel's a lawyer, he's a founder of many institutions. This includes Cape York Partnerships, Good to Great Schools, Cape York Land Council, Upinipima Health Council, Indigenous Enterprises Partnerships, which went on to become Jarwin and go national. And more recently, in 2019, he was appointed to the Senior Advisory Group to help co-design the Indigenous voice to Parliament. Noel's also had a book released earlier this year, Mission, which is a collection of his speeches over many years, which heard him talk wonderfully about on ABC Radio with Virginia Torelli recently. I got to know Noel through the long-term relationship that BCG has had with him and the Indigenous community of Cape York. And BCG was very involved, along with Noel, in helping get Indigenous enterprise partnerships off the ground, and then Jarwin. And I had the great privilege of travelling with Noel on a Jarwin trip to Arakoon, Cohen and Hopevale, and see some of the fantastic work that's going on up there. We've been keen to have Noel give the oration for some time, so without wanting to set a standard, I regard Noel as one of Australia's greatest orators, and we're delighted that you were able to come. We know it's been a tricky issue with COVID, so we're very privileged to have you, Noel Pearson.
Thank you, Larry. I honour the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and bring greetings from Cape York Peninsula. The descendants of Renate Kamener honour me with this privilege of speaking in her memory as an inveterate champion of human rights. It is fitting my subject today is a human right that near disappeared from rights talk in the last quarter of the 20th century and barely resurfaced in these first 2 decades of the 21st, the human right to a job. Thank you, Martin and Larry, for this invitation to tread briefly the path of your mother. I will endeavour to emulate some of her fearlessness and conviction in the dignity of all humans. I thank Larry and my Boston Consulting Group family here in Melbourne and Sydney. Your support is now 22 years long since I entered the circle of friendship of Colin Carter at a gathering in Weipa at the turn of the century. When BCG first committed to support our Cape York agenda, let me thank Colin for his steadfast love for me and my people. Okay, he and BCG have been a great succor to our work. Before making my argument proper, when asked by Larry and Martin last year to nominate a topic for this oration, I confess my temper was febrile, because I chose to evoke Voltaire's 1898 accusations in the Dreyfus case against those at whose feet I will argue responsibility for the needless destruction of needless joblessness might properly be laid. After 6 months of reflection, I have not resiled from my accusations. But let me first accuse myself for not waking up to this argument sooner. Much effort has been in vain, and many lives and futures squandered as long as we have not prosecuted the case for the human right to a job. A human right of all Australians, a human right systematically denied to generations of Australian citizens from the lowest bottom of Australian society. Let me make a second preliminary point about my conviction that Australia's remote communities desperately need a government jobs program, the single most decisive reform. We are serious about the fate of these communities. If leaders are dealers in hope, then the unabating problems of despair in Australia's remote communities, exemplified by the recent media concerning Yuendamu, leaves the nihilists who say, "Fuck hope," in commanding authority. Because the facts on the ground support them. rather than those erstwhile leaders like me who try to deal in hope. Yundamu is only the latest instalment in a decades-long story of despair and long tolerance of misery and destruction of lives. Little has changed for the better and much for the worse. Key numbers are all worse today than the year 2000. The Liberal National Coalition has been as impotent as Labor in the past. There, I've said it. At the state and territory level as well as the Commonwealth. Each is partly right in their own way. Each is wrong-headed in their own way. Both end up being neglectful and putting the misery of remote communities in the too hard basket. And the one thing we have not done is ensured that people in remote communities have the jobs they need to get out of welfare dependency. From the press conferences, we are encouraged to believe Australia has recovered strongly from the pandemic. We're told Australia's job generation performance has outpaced every single G7 economy during the 2 years of the global pandemic, and unemployment is at a 13-year low. But despite the policy insights enabled by the pandemic, Australia is contemplating returning to the past in at least one important respect. A state of affairs in which a significant cohort of Australians are deliberately kept unemployed, so the rest of us can enjoy stable prices. That this cohort is slightly smaller than in the past hides a more complex and ugly reality. Because although unemployment has decreased, hours worked have decreased and underemployment has increased. There is an ongoing tacit acceptance that there will always be Australians relegated to permanent unemployment, and therefore poverty and hopelessness. I too accepted the prevailing economic orthodoxy that tells us we must keep a buffer stock of Australians unemployed to maintain stable prices. I was diverted, along with everyone else, by the ideas that justified permanent structural unemployment for the lowest classes in Australia. I swallowed the fiction that full employment wasn't about every person who wants work having work, that it was some unfixed number determined by the country's economic managers to be around 95% of the workforce with 5% unemployed, the so-called natural rate of unemployment. I accepted that government could not and should not be an employer of last resort for those whom the market could not and did not provide jobs. I accepted what we were told were the fiscal constraints on the government's capacity to afford a full employment program. Moreover, I internalized the general disdain with which public job programs came to be viewed. They were make work, involving painting rocks, and so on. I had, of course, internalised the argument of the economists about the trade-off between employment and inflation, that managing inflation was the first and last imperative. The economic orthodoxy, which for too long I took as gospel, was bolstered by the political rhetoric that demonised the unemployed. For close to 50 years, we, the elites, who have never had it better for ourselves and for our own families, have been convinced by the policy ideas that permeate the nostrums of our culture. And we have come to convince ourselves and other Australians of these same nostrums that unemployment is an individual shortcoming. Australia is a country of lifters and leaners, we have been told. The leaners are dole-bludgers, lazy, indolent and ill-disciplined. This language entered general parlance with the emergence of structural unemployment in the 1970s. Dole-bludgers entered the Australian English lexicon at the same time as scroungers in Britain and welfare queens in America. They have little to offer the nation and are happy to suck money from the pockets of hard-working Australians. They could find a job if they just lifted themselves up by their bootstraps. This all-pervasive narrative not only absolved government of responsibility for unemployment, but allowed politicians to direct Australians' fears and economic securities towards those apparently sucking on the government's teat. If only Australia's leaners would do their share of the lifting. What this narrative elides is there aren't enough jobs for all Australians, especially those without qualifications. Over the past 15 years, entry-level jobs have collapsed by 50%. In June 2021, there were 12 job seeker applicants for each entry-level vacancy. It now takes an average of 4.7 years for a young person to move into a full-time job after completing their education. None of my argument here today is new. Many campaigners for social justice have made the argument for government to step up and become the employer of last resort for the benefit of the lowest and most powerless, needy bottom of society, here and throughout the Western world, to no avail. It was the subject of the last campaign of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who together with trade unionists A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin published the Freedom Budget in 1967, proposing a job guarantee for every American in need of work. This advocacy was continued by his widow, Coretta Scott King, to no avail. As always, Dr. King summed up the hypocrisy of the situation the best when he said, "It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It's cruel to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps." Truth is, unemployment is an economic problem, not a moral one. and the decision to solve it sits with government on behalf of any good society. The Commonwealth has the power to end unemployment for the most needy in Australia, but there has been a bipartisan resistance to using this power. I've spent more than 2 decades lamenting what I came to call passive welfare. It was my conviction that passive welfare is a scourge, not just for my people, but for all disadvantaged Australians, regardless of colour or ethnicity. And my convictions about this remain undimmed. It is the central problem that must be solved to tackle poverty and social exclusion in our nation. We must end passive welfare if we want our country to be a great country for all of us. Furthermore, I always understood the recipients of passive welfare were not to blame for their situation. They were victims of the policy and economic structures that relegated them to the mendicancy of a handout rather than the hand-up of a job. I know this is not a moral failing, as it is too often characterised. My position is between the old left and the old right on this question. I agree with the left that the origins of the problem of welfare dependency are structural and that people are not to blame for the society and economy's failure to provide jobs for all. Too many people on the right are in denial about the structural cause of the problem and only want to see it as a failure of personal responsibility. I agree with the right that long-term welfare dependency erodes personal responsibility and mastery, that it is corrosive to individuals, their families and their communities, and produces family and social breakdown with all of its attendant social problems. Too many people on the left are in denial about the effect of dependency on the collapse of personal responsibility and want to see it as a failure of structural opportunity and of inequality alone. Furthermore, too many people on the left think that the solution is income alone rather than work, which is why there are public campaigns for raising unemployment benefits and for universal basic incomes, no campaigns for jobs. The negative intergenerational effects of passive welfare are real. The left's denial of this reality is matched by the right's hypocrisy in blaming the jobless for their predicament, while simultaneously running an economic policy that keeps a buffer stock of citizens deliberately unemployed. Let me be clear again. Welfare dependency is not the fault of the unemployed. It is a structural problem and fundamentally a policy choice. And the best solution to welfare dependency is to provide the unemployed jobs. It is no coincidence that the word dole bludger was invented in the 1970s, shortly after the abandonment of the commitment to full employment. Before this, unemployment was seen for what it truly is, an economic problem that could be solved through fiscal and monetary action. When Prime Minister John Curtin introduced unemployment benefits in 1945, they were not meant to be a permanent destination. They were a temporary safety net measure that would help people to live in between work and during sickness. Curtin lived through the Depression and witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of mass unemployment. To build an equitable and productive Australia, he knew first and foremost every person had to be offered a job. It was against this background of full employment that welfare was introduced. Curtin saw employment as a right of every Australian. He said, "The Commonwealth Government recognises every Australian's right not merely to unemployment benefits, but to work." And he was willing to use all available levers to create full employment. It was clear Curtin and Chifley believed that over time social security payments would become less necessary. Why? Because government would use its policy tools and financial power to ensure and create full employment. This transformative approach led to a period of unprecedented productivity, with an average unemployment rate of 2% into the early 70s. It was a golden era, overseen by governments that used the Commonwealth's financial muscle to bring about growth, productivity, and prosperity. Compare this to the Australia of the past 40 years. We have locked out the lowest strata of our society from the opportunities of Australian life. We've come to accept that they will be denied a fundamental right of their citizenship, to have a job and earn a living wage. We've come to believe they are a different species of Australian citizen who do not need the same opportunities we have. They can live with deprivations that the rest of us would find impossible. The human catastrophe wrought in the passive welfare era is enormous. Putting aside the original peoples, it would have been unimaginable to Curtin and Chifley, who used the Commonwealth's power to create and deliver opportunity. In the 1970s, a new economic orthodoxy emerged, marking the victory of the ideas of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman over the Keynesians of the post-war era. Daniel Yergin and Joseph Stanislaw tell the story of how the neoliberals waged a relentless war of ideas against Keynes from the midst of the Second World War. Their 1998 book, The Commanding Heights, The Battle for the World Economy, tells how the Keynesian post-war consensus dominated economics around the world. In the 1980s, however, Hayek and Friedman took the commanding heights and became the demigods of economics for the next 40 years, unto this day. Since 1975, Australian policymakers have taken full employment to be causing unemployment to be 5% more or less. But whether this 5% is right or wrong is neither here nor there for elites like us, as the devastation wrought by these policies is of little concern to us. As John Kenneth Galbraith observed, unemployment is rarely considered desirable except by those who have not experienced it. To us elites, the unemployed are not a group of fellow humans left to suffer on the periphery of the Australian economy. They are the economic policy tool of choice in the faux war against inflation. The politicians and technocrats who allowed this social disaster to play out have never been held to account for what was done and is still being done. They destroyed lives. I could take you on a tour of the graves of many of the victims who I knew and who I loved and for whom I grieve. They did this so that the rest of us prospered from the economy they presided over. Reflect on the obscenity. The most disadvantaged propped up the macroeconomic system to manage wages and inflation. 3 to 5% of the country enable the 95% to enjoy the advantages and prosperity that are the right of all Australians, but not available to all. Whenever an Australian politician approves of employment numbers that are less than full employment, they're essentially saying that it is acceptable and correct that this 3 to 5% be excluded from the life-sustaining opportunities other Australians enjoy. Think about it. The Australian structure of economic prosperity and well-being sits on the top of a buffer of permanent unemployment, representing the bodies of the underclass and their children. These are the people for whom educational failure, poor health, out of home care for children, family dysfunction and juvenile and adult incarceration are at acute levels. This is ground zero of the deaths of despair, suicide, addiction, violence, and chronic disease. This underclass suffers these problems intergenerationally, and the country has no solution for them. This much the Productivity Commission admitted in its pre-pandemic 2018 report on rising inequality. About 3% of Australians, they reported, roughly 700,000 people, have been in income poverty continuously for the last 4 years. People living in single-parent families, unemployed people, people with disabilities, and Indigenous Australians are particularly likely to experience income poverty, deprivation, and social exclusion. What is not admitted is that our advantage sits directly atop this misery. If they didn't help make up the numbers of the unemployment buffer, and if they were not forced to gift their families and their bodies to it, we wouldn't have the system of economic management that has underwritten our good fortune for decades now. The fact is, public policy choices were made by the Treasury and the Reserve Bank for the underclass. The Treasury decided public job programs were unaffordable and the Reserve Bank interpreted the data for full employment in a way that could not be more careless of the implications and impact on Australia's poorest citizens. The choices they made spoke volumes for their concern for this underclass. They never saw any value in them. They never saw that the children of the debilitated should have the chance to be free of debility themselves if proper public policy were made in their favour. Why should intergenerational disadvantage be taken to be inevitable, unbreakable, and acceptable? Economist William Mitchell's design of a federal job guarantee, proposing an employment buffer through a minimum wage, makes this story even more sickening. This is what I realised 2 years ago, reading Mitchell's work. It was not necessary to use an unemployment buffer to manage wage inflation. Inflation could be managed through an employment buffer using the minimum wage. For the past 30 years, I've watched the devastation of my people from Cape York Peninsula from intergenerational welfare dependency. The awarding of equal wages for Aboriginal stock workers did not result in the economic equity many had hoped for. Many lost their jobs, migrated to townships, and are today churned through unsuccessful employment programs with no real pathways to the mainstream economy. The 1970s saw many Indigenous people, along with other Australians, moved on to welfare where they stayed for life. This social catastrophe was complemented by the introduction of pubs and poker machines, which allow welfare checks to be recycled back to government and their corporate friends in these vice industries. Verily, as the black American economist Thomas Sowell once said, the poor are a gold mine. But my people were not the only victims of the shift away from full employment. Since the mid-1970s, the number of long-term unemployed in Australia has continued to rise, despite 30 years of uninterrupted growth for the rest of us. There are now pockets of suburbs and towns that have experienced between 50 to 70% unemployment over successive generations. All of our communities in Cape York Peninsula fall into this category. Since the mid-1970s, we, the Australian elite, abandoned full employment with little regard for the impact on the most marginalised, the disabled, the poorly educated, Indigenous people, newly arrived non-English speaking migrants, and sole parents. Australia was never meant to be a country of haves and have-nots. Those who reconstructed the nation after World War II were at pains to ensure no one was left out, putting aside the original peoples. They truly believed everyone had something to contribute, putting aside the original peoples. And they designed policies to ensure this occurred, putting aside the original peoples. The dividend was a nation that experienced unprecedented productivity and full employment, putting aside the original peoples. Please pardon my repeated qualifications here. I have the difficult task of trying to remind mainstream Australians of the golden years of post-war full employment and prosperity for white and migrant Australians, whilst not forgetting that the Indigenous peoples were still excluded from this growth and opportunity. It is the same dilemma Americans have when they remember the great advances made as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, whilst having to admit the exclusion of black Americans from its benefits was also the truth. But allow me to nevertheless evoke the memory of the prosperity of the post-war period for your people, especially the disadvantaged among them. Regrettably, more than 7 decades after World War II, Australia is a country of haves and have-nots. This is not because we had to be, but because of policy choices that were made. The people of Cape York were the first movers on welfare reform in Australia. We knew it was our right to take responsibility for our future. We got on the front foot and designed a reform model that focused on building the capability of those on welfare so they could take a fair place in our own land, in our own country, Australia. The people whose dispossession, in the famous words of Justices Dean and Gaudron in Mabo's case, underwrote the development of the nation. We designed the Family Responsibilities Commission. Run by local leaders, the Commission builds the capability of those on welfare who have not exercised responsibilities in caring for their children, sending them to school, upholding their housing arrangements, and refraining from violence. The Commission conferences our people and supports them to take up the personal responsibilities which passive welfare has eroded. 14 years on, and this model is yielding profoundly important results. Over the past 6 years in the 5 communities in which it operates, child protection notices have reduced by 69%. Tenancy breaches have dropped, and serious offences have fallen by 20%. Money management has improved, and parents have saved hundreds of thousands of dollars collectively in student trust accounts to cover the costs of their children and grandchildren's education. The Cape York welfare reform model is working on the personal and family responsibility side of the equation. Personal responsibility is crucial to progress. The other side of the welfare reform equation is opportunity, and in particular, the opportunity of jobs. But jobs have not been realised as part of the welfare reform deal. The results we've achieved with personal and family responsibilities would be amplified if people were provided with real jobs. Over the past 14 years, job numbers in our communities have remained stagnant. Close to 70% of our people are unemployed. Most live in social housing. In our original report to the Commonwealth Government in 2007, we argued that quid pro quo for responsibility and obligations should be opportunities for jobs, education and home ownership. The gap in Indigenous affairs will only be closed when responsibility and opportunity are combined equally. Attempts to achieve this are non-existent in Australia. President Bill Clinton tried with the enactment of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996. Let me repeat the name of this legislation. because it captures correctly the necessary policy combination, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. The legislation aimed to reconcile the behavioural dimension of welfare dependency and the structural opportunity of employment. It is clear this reconciliation was dependent on the availability of work. The deal showed signs of working during the Clinton years of growth, when jobs became available but could not be sustained in the downturn. You can mandate personal responsibility, but if you leave work opportunity to the market, then the reconciliation collapses when there's a downturn. True reconciliation required the mandating of personal responsibility and work opportunity. If Clinton had done this, he would have fulfilled Dr. King's vision in the Freedom Budget, whose bedrock was a government jobs program. He didn't do it. He mandated only one side of the equation. He was under the grip of the neoliberal turn in social democratic economic policy thinking that resisted full employment as socialist nostalgia in favour of market solutions. Moreover, the pittance of the American minimum wage and the unconscionable way in which workers in the lower strata of the labour force have to stitch together multiple jobs to earn a living made the pro rata reforms a tragic farce. If we're going to close the gap, not only between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but between the unemployed and the rest of Australia, we must ensure there are enough jobs for all those able to work and who want work. 2 years ago, I had to confront this great truth, a truth that had never been fully apparent to me. The truth was that full employment was possible without letting the inflation genie out of the bottle. I'd swallowed the economic orthodoxy that 5% unemployment was the price the nation had to pay for economic stability, continued private sector investment, and high living standards. That was until I read University of Newcastle economics professor William Mitchell's proposal for a universal job guarantee. His concept is simple. It is a job for all those needing and able to work. The job pays the minimum wage, superannuation contributions, and leave entitlements. It brings the dignity of work to every Australian, including the disabled, mentally ill, and extremely disadvantaged. And it is a completely superior alternative to passive welfare. The first benefit of the job guarantee is that it lifts the income of the poorest Australians to a decent level. Only those who have never lived on the dole can say that people can live on the dole. The second benefit of the job guarantee is that it gives people all of the intangible, personal, psychological, and social benefits that come with work. Only those accustomed to the opportunity of work can afford the luxury of the idea that work is not foundational to the well-being of all humans. Mitchell's insight on the government job guarantee came to him as a student studying agricultural economics at this university in the late 1970s. Learning the logic of the one-time wool stabilisation scheme to stabilise the income of producers through the seasonal heights and troughs of the clip and to minimise inflationary prices, the scheme provided for the government to buy the surplus and store it in those ubiquitous red brick wool sheds near the country's wharves. The retained surplus was released in the years when the clip was poor. The anguished memory of his working-class father's descent into unemployment had become the young student's life-defining purpose. And he asked himself, if the government could buy up idle wool from producers and release it to the market when demand picked up, why could not the same be done with idle labour? This was Mitchell's eureka moment, and he dedicated his life to the pursuit of full employment and the concept of a government-funded job guarantee. The crucial breakthrough Mitchell made with his job guarantee is that its design would mean that full employment with the government as employer of last resort would be non-inflationary. He argues that there are two ways to manage inflation in employment policy. The first, to use unemployment as a buffer, stock against pressures, and the second is to use employment as the buffer stock. Providing the job guarantee is anchored at the minimum wage, a universally available full employment scheme will not be inflationary. From Mitchell, we have the means to achieve full employment without increasing inflation. This is the third benefit of the guarantee. It works as an automatic stabiliser in the economy. The pool of workers in the scheme rises and falls with the economic cycle. In a downturn, the pool grows, and when the labour market picks up, the pool shrinks close to zero. Mitchell has provided a policy solution to the social catastrophe playing out amongst Australia's most disadvantaged. In Indigenous policy in particular, Mitchell has given us the most powerful policy tool to close the gap, not just on employment, but most other gaps dependent upon employment, something which has addled the bureaucrats and technocrats. Since discovering Mitchell's proposal, I've advocated to all governments for a universal job guarantee. I've been told in response that the jobs would be unproductive. Aboriginal people would just be painting rocks. The scheme would undercut private investment. It would antagonise the unions. It would drain the budget. The unemployed aren't capable of working. But these are not the real reasons for the lack of interest. The real reason is that acceptance of Mitchell's argument would require us, the new elites of the neoliberal turn, to admit we have it wrong. It would require we, the new elites of the neoliberal turn, to admit that we aided and abetted a social catastrophe of enormous scale amongst the voiceless Australians. It would require we, the elites of the neoliberal turn, to consider the family breakdown, addiction, violence, misery and suffering that our policies have caused to the voiceless Australians. It would require we, the elites of the neoliberal turn, to admit that the unemployed are not innately lazy or defective. It would require we, the elites of the neoliberal turn, to admit the government has the fiscal capacity to fund real jobs instead of passive welfare, but has chosen not to use it. And most excruciatingly, it would require we, the elites of the neoliberal turn, to change the system that has gifted us and our own families significant wealth and power at a time when the unemployed and their families broken and left bereft. The reasons we struggle to gain traction on a job guarantee are threefold. Firstly, so many of us, myself included, submitted to the economic orthodoxy that lower levels of unemployment will be inflationary. Secondly, this orthodoxy suited business, who prefer that at the lowest reaches of the economy, the scarcity of work should maintain a race to the bottom on wages. And finally, the political class know that our social security system does an outstanding job at pacifying the excluded and the disadvantaged by cutting off their hope and aspiration and giving them the false promise that their secondary services and programs will ameliorate their personal and social problems. And if not, then the tertiary services in the form of end-stage medical care, out-of-home care for children, and detention and incarceration facilities can always be expanded. And it is the passive, not the capable, that neither threaten nor make demands on the political system for a better deal. The unemployed become conditioned to think they are inferior and undeserving of anything better, and they give up. I accuse successive Australian governments of deliberately confining over 800,000 Australians to the unemployment line as a permanent destination where they unnecessarily suffer from poverty, powerlessness and prejudice. I accuse the Reserve Bank of Australia of not meeting its legislative mandate of full employment by uncritically upholding ideas about a natural rate of unemployment. They destroyed countless lives, the consequences of which they and their own never have to bear. I accuse the Treasury of peddling the fiction that unemployment is natural, inevitable, and necessary to control inflation and resist fiscal intervention in favour of jobs for those Australians in desperate need of them in the name of budgetary rectitude and debt management, but are quick to change their view when a pandemic threatens the jobs of Middle Australia. I accuse politicians for using the unemployed for political gain by directing people's economic insecurities and fears towards the most disadvantaged and away from government itself. I accuse the industry of job agencies of undertaking a fictitious tick-the-box exercise that does nothing to help the unemployed, but instead delivers profits to those who least need them. I accuse the Liberals and Conservatives of purveying the term dole bludger and creating the illusion that unemployment is an individual moral problem rather than a structural problem perpetuated by neglectful governments. And I accuse Social Democrats and the left for not doing enough to challenge the economic orthodoxy that has so deadened the nation's economic reform aspirations, and in doing so abandoning the country's most vulnerable citizens who look to them to champion their cause. Lastly, I accuse myself of not having the policy insight and courage to have said this before. I implore the political parties of all persuasions to gather up the moral and political courage to face these truths, to transform our conventional thinking, and to move past the old, false orthodoxies. I implore the Parliament and the new executive government in the next term to wield its monetary and fiscal power to guarantee full employment for all Australians. Thank you.
Wow. Well, Noel, you certainly didn't disappoint. That was quite extraordinary. So I know we started a bit late. We might run about 10 minutes late beyond the 5:30 that I think we indicated to allow some time for questions. So we'll have about 15 minutes of questions. I think Kim's going to pass through some questions if she gets questions from the online. I think we've got quite a large group of people who've been following this online. But we'll start with people in the room. And Noel, I'll get you to come back up. Who would like to kick us off? Maybe just say your name when you.
As an ex-teacher, I mightn't need it, but you've used, just a quick, very brief comment, you've used the term haves and have-nots. I think we now have the have-nots, the haves and the have-yots. My question relates to your frequent use of the term Australians and citizens, and you made some passing reference to, for example, newly arrived migrants. But there are people refused, people like found to be refugees, but as Eve Lester says in her book on migration law and policy, there is planned destitution of people who are not citizens and can't even get residency unless they wait a long, long time and pay a lot of money. Yeah. So my question is, do you have a response to that?
I hear what you're saying. How can I disagree with that?
Thanks, Noel, for a fantastic speech. Matt Tinkler's my name. I'm the CEO at Save the Children here. Last week I was in Palmerston Indigenous village with my team, and they lamented the decline of the Commonwealth Jobs program and the impact they'd seen in that community and the lack of productivity and community care. So they would certainly agree with you. My question is, to make a shift at this scale, the question of what jobs would people do becomes relevant, the productive jobs that give people meaning and purpose and contribute to society. Based on your experience in Cape York or elsewhere, what are your views on the kind of jobs that should be targeted and created for this kind of program?
Oh, there's absolutely no shortage of things that need to be done urgently. It would have really important implications for the people, their social services, the education of children, looking after the environment, looking after the elderly, looking after the disabled. There's no shortage of work that people need to be mobilised to undertake and receive fair payment for. Put our imaginations to work and the jobs will be in front of our noses. That's what we've done in the Cape. We can achieve much better outcomes in education and health and services to our people if we had a job guarantee program that provided a If people desired a full-time job for 5 days, they could choose to have that, or a part-time job if they chose a part-time job. Everybody needing work should be able to have access to it. One of the things we will have to do, though, since you come from the social services sector, at some point we're going to have to... I see the primary problem is the loss of work. That's a solution. Secondary services are just a response to that failure. And at some point we're going to have to get rid of the secondary services because they are a diversion of the necessary resources. We need to do it now because there's urgency and misery. But when we strengthen families and they have access to jobs, I see secondary programs, the rise of the service delivery middle class as part of the problem here. It's given us the sense that the problem with these people is that they need the services from the middle class. They need the middle class to have the jobs to save these people. So we keep building out the investment in the secondary support, and we fail to invest in the primary failing. Good education, a good job, rebuild the families. What does a family need? Money, income, need to look after the money, need support in doing so, need to support their children in their education, and the school must give them an education, not the shit that remote kids currently get from their schools. They need the health services available so the mum and dad can take them down there and receive attention. Parents must engage in that. And they need a home that's safe and prideful and happy. You get those things together, that's log cabin to White House stuff. But instead, we're now at this stage where we're creating industries out of the misery. Secondary service industries, and of course, end result is the investment in the tertiary stage grows as well. Prisons, diabetes and other health complications and so on. So, we've got to stop thinking that secondary services are a solution here. They've got to be a stopgap. We're going to be very careful about those secondary services turning into industries because they have. Out-of-home care has become an industry. There's industries all over the joint when it comes to disadvantaged people. And they're industries that give jobs not to the disadvantaged, they give it to the middle class.
Terry.
Hey, Terry. How's it going, mate?
I get a microphone first. So you can hear me. Things are going pretty well in some senses, but I wanted to support your comments and Gareth made the obvious point, well, how do you deliver what needs to be done? And I thought I'd make a couple of comments on that to amuse Gareth because you already know it. Noel and I first met in the late 90s, I think, when I went to Cape York.
98, 99.
Yeah, and I was at that stage doing a review of Indigenous education in Queensland. And the school at Arakuan was just a shambles. The parents were neglectful, the very things that you spoke about before. And it was the community under your leadership and other communities in Cape York that turned it around with some assistance from the state government, particularly in terms of setting up the family responsibility commissions. So it is possible to do it, but the key point is it has to happen at the local community level because the Commonwealth Government is no longer of any use, perhaps apart from the source of money, in doing something like this. When Rudd announced the Changing the Gap initiative, we set about doing that through bringing back a guy who'd worked for the United Nations and had been posted to one of the most troubled countries in the north of Africa. And the idea was he would have the authority to go into communities, work with communities and say what needed to be done, and the government departments would be compelled to put money and effort into making it happen. This was to be legislated, and it was the senior levels of the Commonwealth bureaucracy that made sure that that didn't happen, and that the whole strategy for dealing with that problem didn't really have the resources or effort required to make it deliver. Now, my final point is that in Victoria and New South Wales now, through work at the Centre for Policy Development, the CEO for which is here, we've actually found a constructive approach at the community level to finding jobs for the most disadvantaged. And the first big trial we ran was, and you may not know, but it's a big LGA to the west of Melbourne called Wyndham. It had an inspired CEO, and she made it all happen in partnership with us. And so it can be done, but the Commonwealth Government can put money in, although in this case it was philanthropic money. But apart from that, they are beyond redemption in terms of an ability to design new programs and administer them and reach out into the community. The health department, the education department, 85% of their staff are all in Canberra. They seldom get out and see what's going on around them. The APS in the social policy field is a total failure. So if you're thinking that you can ginger up Canberra to do something, I'm afraid that it won't work.
I completely agree. I mean, the delivery point has got to be local government. But even there, the capacity will have to be rebuilt. So certainly our thinking is that local government has got to be the delivery mechanism for a jobs program in the communities. And the Commonwealth's role is as the funder.
Noel, there's quite a few questions coming online. Quite a few of them involve people who were part of the CD. Wondering whether what you're talking about is bringing back some form of that. How would you differentiate what was offered in the past by the CDP?
Yeah, it's not the work for the dole. A job guarantee is not work for the dole, either in its design or, importantly, amount of work you're offered and its pay. It's a 5-day job offer, full-time work for those who want it, and it would be paid at the minimum wage, which is almost double work for the dole. Not working for New Start. It's a real job, a complete job, pays people at the minimum wage and becomes the platform. So it almost doubles the income that will go into families. These families need that income. They need more income desperately. But it will be a spur for the young people in particular, but all of those, it will be a spur for them to then look for better paying opportunities. So when there are opportunities for mainstream jobs outside of the job guarantee scheme, they will be in the position both in terms of their mindset, in terms of their skills and in terms of their training to take up those opportunities. So it is the necessary transitional work program to enable people to get into the mainstream work when it becomes available.
Thank you for being an inspirational Australian leader. I'm horrified that even in my postgraduate study I was taught about accepting exactly the point that you made today, and it's really been super interesting. My question is there anywhere in the world, you mentioned the Clinton administration, is there anywhere, maybe Scandinavia, that's trialled something like not accepting a standard unemployment rate?
There have been partial trials in some countries of the job guarantee idea. The importance of a universal scheme is to enable the stabiliser effect of the scheme. Having it as a universal solution for all unemployed people is an important part of the design of it. I suspect that will be the question going forward, whether governments try to trial a region or a cohort that might be offered the opportunities of a job guarantee. But there are important policy questions around the need for universality. And my view is that we should now be pushing for a universal program, black and white, and so that all Australians understand that this is an Australian solution for all Australians standing in need of work. Not just for Aboriginal people, it's not just for Cape York people. All Australians are now got the offer of a job under a job guarantee scheme. And I think, I'm a very strong advocate that a universal basic income doesn't address an important part of the problem of passive welfare. Got to be in complete denial about the effect of welfare on people if you think that a universal basic income is any kind of credible response to it. So I think the sheer increase in the investment in these communities and regions will itself generate real jobs in the economy. People will have more disposable income, and they will be investing it in the creation of new job opportunities in those particularly depressed regions of the country where youth unemployment is so high and so on.
Thank you, Noel. We are out of time, and I'm sorry because I know there's quite a few more questions around, and I know there's more questions online. But I'm going to hand over to Ken Smith from the Australian New Zealand School of Government, who organised the facilities here for us at the very last minute. So to say a final vote of thanks to Noel.
Look, thanks, Larry. We were happy to step in a couple of weeks ago when Ormond had the problems with COVID, and it's great to see so many people here. Great to see my old friend and colleague, Noel. Not being as old as you, Terry, but I think Noel and I go back into the early 90s. And when I first went up to Queensland, but the work in the Cape York Institute, the Family Responsibility Commission, the development of the Academy have been really important. And today's lecture has shown this breadth of your intellect, the canvas that you painted, the challenges that it has come to us all. You challenged yourself at the end of the speech, and we need to all be challenged about what we're doing to get over entrenched disadvantage, what the impact is of not having a job, of welfare passivity, and of generations of people that are being lost, particularly in remote and very remote communities. I'm very much involved in school funding now and looking at school funding issues. There's a huge drop-off in the cliff of educational attainment in remote and very remote communities. And who does that impact? It impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the challenges you put today, Noel, are important challenges. They're challenges that we all need to meet. And I thank you for your talk today. And Todd, thank you for that introduction, and congratulations on being appointed to the commission. Thanks very much, everyone.
And thanks to all of those who are here online. A number of people have asked about, will the speech be published? It will be available soon, I think, Noel, on our website. This has also been videoed, and as it's been streamed, and there will be a connection to if you've got friends who you want to see it or you want to see it again, it'll be available on the Renate Kamener Oration website as well. Thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing many of you at next year's oration.